Let's start here. We've got our panel back, Howard Franklin, Mark Roundtree, veteran political strategist. You've got a lot of experience on election nights. Let's start with this race here. We've been talking a lot about it, especially actually when we're on commercial break. So let's bring everybody into the conversation. The race for the U.S. House in District 13, it pitted incumbent Representative David Scott against a pretty wide field of challengers. That race has now been called. David Scott survives. He moves on to the general election. What do you make of this?
Well, I think it says a couple things. One, I think a number of the challengers have presented themselves as offering a generational shift. We've got relatively young both candidates and former elected officials in a couple of these cases. And I think, they've made this case that they've got vitality and vigor to bring to Congress, whereas Congressman Scott has bringing a ton of experience, right? And he's had seniority. He's just chaired the agriculture committee just in the last body. So I think there is an argument at a macro level that maybe the voters aren't buying. I think also just again we've talked about this before, but there's a big hurdle to climb to get to a congressional seat, right? This is not a $50,000 or $100,000 race, right? And as a ranking member in some really important and key committees, David Scott can raise significant money. He's got tremendous name recognition, and I think a lot of folks also, challengers, have looked at reapportionment as an opportunity to say, I can go win voters that you haven't had to talk to yet. But Georgia's between qualifying and the actual election is just a couple months. So it's not a ton of time to raise a lot of money or to go talk to tens of thousands of voters. So structurally, it's more challenging than a lot of challengers find it.
And if there was going to be a runoff, you would think, just given the amount of challengers that he had, this might have been it. But as we could see by the numbers, no runoff. I mean, nearly 60% of the vote.
Yeah, which he's held steady at for the last several years.
Yeah.
This actually is not a very good election result, all things being equal, I would argue.
For Representative Scott.
For Representative Scott. You have Loudermilk tonight, the incumbent Republican, winning 85% of the vote. You've got McBath winning 85% of the vote, I mean, in that range. And then you have Scott winning 59%. And a night where incumbents are winning nearly every race in the entire state. So falling to 59 against a series of basically unknown, underfinanced candidates is not that strong of a result. I'm not saying that he would be vulnerable in a general election. This is a Democratic seat. It just is a Democratic seat. But it is something that somebody could, what this doesn't do is pass the hurdle to say 2 years from now, a well-funded candidate might look at this and say, I see a weakness.
Somebody may see an opening for a future challenge, you think?
That's what it looks like to me. To me, if unknown underfunded candidates are going to total 41% of the vote, a well-funded candidate who can self-finance, because that's what it's going to take pretty much in this district to defeat an incumbent, somebody who can basically put up $500,000 and say, go.
I think Mark is right, but I think the challenges, and we've seen several over the last, let's call it 6 years, are probably thinking, I need to be first runner-up because when David Scott does decide to retire, I will have put my mark on this seat. I'll have run for it enough times. I'll have enough institutional support that I'll be first runner-up or the person in the seat when that seat becomes open.
And it's becoming more and more common for people to self-finance their campaign. Marjorie Taylor Greene certainly did. Rich McCormick invested heavily in his successful career, start of a career for Congress. So there are candidates that basically can self-fund, and I would look at this down the road and say, this hurdle, this was a kind of a low result for a guy that should have probably carried 75% of the vote, 80% of the vote.
I want to touch on November, though, because there is going to be a contest. Jonathan Chavez taking away the 68.8% to go against him. Is there a chance for Chavez? You said that this is going to be a Democratic seat.
It's a pretty significantly, I mean, Howard, you may know the lean on this. Is this what a point, this 15
even
points or something
very
like that?
solidly Democratic seat.
It's not the most Democratic district in the state, but it's definitely Democratic. So it'll be difficult, but you never say never. I mean, you never say never.
And if we have time, I want to talk about one other race because you mentioned her name, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a name that everybody knows outside of Georgia as well. There are Democrats who are trying to unseat her, and it looks like that race in District 14 is going to go into a runoff. Sean Harris versus Clarence Blaylock. There we go. Sorry, Clarence. What do you guys think about this race?
I just think it's interesting that 2 years ago, Marcus Flowers, who we just talked about as one of the challengers to Congressman David Scott, was in this race. I think he raised something on the order of $14 million. And he did so because MTG had become a national phenomenon. And he was able to go to Democratic donors across the country and say, I'm running against this person, never mind that I have no shot at beating her. And so you've got a couple folks here, maybe they're looking to run the same playbook. I'm not entirely sure, but I think to Mark's earlier point, most of these races are won in the primary. The general election is a foregone conclusion for these partisan races.
And Marcus Flowers also ran this year, but as we could see, David Scott, I mean, he only took away about 9.7%, but in District 13.
In District 13.
Not in 14. Mark, we have just a couple seconds. Did you want to speak on District 14?
No, not necessarily. I would add maybe one thing. This is not a moderate Republican district. This is one of the most conservative, most Republican districts in the country. There's a significant portion of this particular district that I wouldn't even call necessarily Republican. It's conservative first. And if a more conservative candidate emerged, they'd go with that. And that's who Marjorie has been able to appeal to up to this point. And maybe she needs to watch her Republican flank just a little bit. Now, she's not vulnerable in a general election, but in a primary in the future, that's, I think, some of the damage that she's maybe taken on politically.
This is one of the first races that we've talked about that we know for a fact now is headed to a runoff. There will likely be more as we continue to get results in throughout the night. And the good news is we're going to continue to be tracking it all night long, Faith.
We're not going anywhere just yet, folks. We're going to take a small break here, but we want you to stick around because we're going to be back in just 15 minutes with more results and more analysis. We'll see you then.